and thank you for this invitation. I'm really glad I'm allowed to be here today. Before I start, because it's such a theoretical topic, I wrote my text and I will read it because otherwise we will get a big mess and nobody's gonna understand anything. So I'm sorry for that. That I'm going to read it, not that it's a theoretical topic. My today's lecture is about praxeology, and from theory to a method for historical and longue durée studies. Before I'm going into the topic of praxeology and how this can be used as a method for longue durée studies, I will shortly introduce my PhD project for some context. After this, I will not only go into praxeological theories, but I will also dive into cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, which comes from biology, and diffusion of innovation theory, which allows me to describe changing practices over time. After presenting the main points of these three theories, I will merge them together and I will use this as the basis for the methodology I propose to study changing practices. I will end my presentation with a short example analysis in which I will demonstrate the method. As I am not this far in my PhD project, I cannot show you any results yet. My PhD project is called Navigating Through Text on Reading Practices and the Evolution of Textual Articulation and Navigational Aids in the Institutiones. In this project, I study reading practices over the course of about 1,000 years. And for this, I am following one text through time, the Justinian Institutes. This law text was compiled and written in 1530 till 1533, Common Era, commissioned by Justinian the Great. It is a law text specifically meant for learning about law in an educational context as much as it was active law. The text itself stays stable through the centuries and was studied at the universities. The oldest remaining fragment of the text stems from the 8th till the 10th century. They're not sure about the date. In order to study the reading practices, I mainly focus on the mise en page or layout of the text. I specifically study textual articulation, or in other words, how are text structures made visible. I brought a few examples to illustrate what I mean by this. All pictures come from the same manuscript from Bamberg, which is dated around 10th till 11th century. On this slide, you see the beginning of the text as a whole, starting with a rubric. This part. To introduce the text and a large initial at the actual beginning of the text itself. Here we see the beginning of the first book. The institutes are divided into multiple books, so this part, including the rubric. The books are divided into multiple titles. Here we see the second title of the first book, the one in red. And then titles are divided into paragraphs. Here we see the beginning of the first paragraph of the second title of the first book. It is here. I study all those elements and how they change over time in order to learn about reading practices. Next to textual articulation, I study navigational aids, such as a table of content, running heads, and indices that help the reader to find certain information within a text. They navigate the reader. My PhD has a theoretical core from which I build my analysis. This is based on praxeology and the theme of my talk today. I will have a very broad introduction to praxeology, not specifically altered to reading practices, so it can be used in many different subfields of historical studies. In short, praxeology is about the study of practices which are bundles of actions or a nexus of doings and sayings that are shared among members of society. In praxeological studies, the focus is on the practice itself and not on individuals. It consists of a range of theories that deal with the subject of practices. A few of the most influential theories within praxeology are Pierre Bourdieu, Theodor Schatzky, and Andreas Reckwitz. Reckwitz argues that one needs 4 elements for a praxeological analysis: the body, materiality, routinization, and historicity. I will follow Andreas Rekwitz's structure to introduce the main elements of practice theories in the following part of my presentation. Naturally, the focus of practice theories is on practices. It is about the execution of practices by multiple bodies that use artifacts. According to praxeological theories, a practice requires the actions of an individual. Without the presence of the body, a practice cannot be performed. Therefore, the first component of a practice is referred to as the agent, subject, or body, which refers to the acting person. Practices are seen as routinized bodily activities, which can include significant physical movements, but also more intellectual activities, such as reading or speaking, are considered routinized bodily activities. If we're taking reading as a physical book in the West in the 21st century, as an example, the practice involves multiple actions: opening the book, perusing the title page and the table of contents, and finally proceeding to the main text. While reading, one looks at the page, follows the letters line by line, from the left to the right and top to bottom. These sequence of letters form words, and those words we assign meaning to. However, the ability to understand the meaning of these letters and words relies on having learned how to read. Thus, practices are skillful performances executed by competent bodies. To achieve a skillful performance, the action of the practice must be routinized by the body, which is accomplished by the embodiment of knowledge. To get an insight in the embodiment of practices, Pierre Bourdieu's notion of habitus has often been studied. There is no single definition of habitus by Bourdieu. It is necessary to extract its meaning from various statements and explanations. The habitus is the matrix in which the subject thinks, observes, and acts. Bourdieu elaborates further that the habitus is the durably installed generative principle of regulated improvisations that produces practices. These practices tend to reproduce the regularities immanent in the objective condition of the production of the generative principle, while adjusting to the demand inscribed as objective potentialities in the situation as defined by the cognitive and motivating structures making up the habitus. That's a lot of word for the habitus is result from practices as much as practices form the basis for the habitus. Therefore, the habitus is a constant dialectical relationship with the practice. When practices change, the habitus alters, and when the habitus alters, practices may change. The habitus is a set of codes or immanent law, a framework in which the body acts. Therefore, the habitus not only results from practices and forms the basis for practices, it forms also a set of codes that can actively be observed by its bodies. These inherent codes allow for certain practices. That does not always have to be the exact same practices. As long as the practice fits within the ever-changing habitus, it allows for different practices and a certain amount of creativity. The habitus needs to be embodied by its subjects because the habitus is a characteristic of the body. It is this embodiment that allows the subject to understand the habitus and reproduce practices that fit within the habitus. Subjects in a certain society share the habitus because they embody the same structures that came from the same set of practices. As long as the subjects share a habitus, they are sharing the same set of codes, which allows them to perform practices within this habitus, and consequently, they, as a group, contribute to the construct of the habitus. In short, the habitus is the result of a reciprocal interaction that allows for a practice to come into being, as well as it is shaped by practices. The habitus forms a shared code within society and therefore reduces the individual to society. Bodies are the site of the social, and in praxeological analysis, culture is studied through subjects and artifacts. One of the fundamentals of praxeological theory that practices are executed through material. Often, a practice not only requires competent bodies to know how to perform and practice, but also distinct artifacts in order for a practice to come into being. To execute it and to reproduce the practice, to execute it and to reproduce the practice. Therefore, the location of the practice is within the bodies and the artifacts used to carry out a practice. According to Bruno Latour actor network theory, there is no distinction drawn between object and subject, but instead associations and connections between humans and non-human dependents are made. The non-human dependents reflect the landscape of the social. The social leaves its traces when associations between elements that are not social in themselves, such as materials and artifacts, are made. It is the immanent structure of the artifact that shows how the object can be used. This is called its affordance. This does not mean that is the only way the object is or will be used. The object enables, influences, allows, prevents, offers for certain uses of this object. A pencil, for example, can be used to write or draw, but can also be used as a temporary bookmark. It can be put behind an ear, as maybe a carpenter might do, or used to put up hair. The non-human dependents materialize knowledge within a practice, since they are inherently connected and interwoven with bodies, but the material world is not providing meaning in itself. This meaning is given by the humans using artifacts, and in those actions they construct and reconstruct meaning. Artifacts can have multiple meanings, all of them derived primarily from action. Next to a know-how about artifacts and how to use them, bodies intervene with the world and bring about material change in it. As practices change, humans can change the artifacts they use for them in order to make them fit the practice better. The interaction between bodies and artifacts are the observable practice, and the objects or material entities are the objects that can be interpreted. Objects can thus be seen as objects of knowledge. Practices that involve objects can still be studied today, since the material object reflects the practice and therefore reflects a past time. I want to stress that within practice theories, bodies as well as artifacts are seen as the side of the social, even though in historical praxeology it is impossible to study bodies and the practice in action. Practice theories are not about individual acts, because one individual act does not make a practice. It is the routinizing of activities and chains of activities that forms the practice. The focus is therefore on multiple activities that forms such a practice. A chain of actions composed of activities as a component for one or more practices. A chain of actions is a component for one or more practices. An activity such as lifting a glass with a beverage is an action that can lead to several practices, such as drinking the beverage, but also to toasting, or when it is the waiter lifting the glass, it might be to hand it out to a guest, and it would then be part of the practice of serving a beverage. On the one hand, the focus is on the routinization in the form of chain of actions. On the other hand, practices are about routinization of practice within a society. Schatzky argues that firstly, practices are not sets of individual action. A practice is a manifold of doings and sayings. And secondly, such a set of doings and sayings constitutes a practice only if its members express an array of understandings, rules, and structure. In other words, Schatzky argues that practices are always bound into society and cannot be the actions of just one person. Likewise, as argued by Reckwitz, practices are behavioral patterns that exist in a broader context than the individual. The sharing of the practice is seen as an integral part of the routinization of the practice. The performing of the same practices, the sharing of practices, is the central point of the routinization of practices. In fact, it is important for any practice that the practice is shared with others who also understand and carry out the practice. A discourse in how a certain practice should be carried out is formed by repeating the practice over and over. All practices, when carried out, are constitution as well as a reproduction. of a practice. When carrying out, a practice is never exactly the same. The person acting and the context changes. But many bodies carrying out very similar actions in the same sequence and with the same meaning are constituting a practice. When practice theorists talk about how carrying out a practice constitutes certain practices, then this does not mean that these practices are determined by practices, but that a practice has formed itself in a way that a pattern can be recognized by an observant. In other words, practices are never exactly the same when they are carried out. They are following patterns. There are two sides of the logic of the practice. The changing characteristics of the social practices that contains openness and the ability to change will compel an actor to skillfully and at the same time routinized deal with those changes. But the routinization of the practice does not allow for reciting an altered practice over and over, because then it will be a different practice that comes into being. In summary, practices are routinized chains of actions that are reproduced by and shared among members of society. Practices follow patterns, and within different contexts and in different temporalities, subjects have to react to new circumstances, and by that the practice may alter. Social fields are loosely combined complexes of practices and subjects that can be seen as loosely networks of knowledge forms, can lead or force to miscarrying or altering a practice. This is not seen as a contradiction, but rather the other side of the medal. The change of action, the interruption of routinization is conforming the discourse. This segment of praxeological theory is about the meaning and implications of the practice. Within praxeological theories, it is believed that cultural codes are enclosed within practices and that these codes form practices at the same time. It is therefore a reciprocal relationship. Meaning is in sociological practical research only interpretable as practical meaning. It comes into being through the performance of the practice and shows itself in the execution of the practice. In other words, meaning comes into existence in carrying out a practice and allows the association between bodies and objects. The understanding of a practice is materialized understanding, or as formulated by Schatzky, quote, "The meaning of an object is what the object is understood to be. There is no meaning independently of understanding," end quote. The meaning of a practice is therefore always based on a tick description as introduced by Gilbert Ryle and further developed by Clifford Geertz. Almost all acts can be part of multiple practices. Consequently, it is the context of the act that leads to the meaning and interpretation of the practice. Just the one act and its description can be considered a tin description, like lifting a glass of beer. With just the information lifting a glass of beer, there's no way to know about the meaning of it. This lifting might lead to serving a glass of beer, throwing a glass of beer, drinking a glass of beer, etc. However, the meaning of this lifting of the glass of beer within a sequence of acts, for example, lifting a glass of beer, followed by poking it to another glass of beer, held by another person and saying cheers, is a description of its context. And this tick description helps to determine the meaning of the practice known as toasting. We can only ascribe meaning to a practice when this meaning is intended. The meaning is based on the habitus. When a habitus is not shared, the meaning of a practice might not be understood by another individual. As a consequence, Schatzky says practices are not the site of those meanings that reflect states of affairs that are not intentionally set up in the practice. The tension field between reproduction and innovation, or stability and instability, is a complicated theme within practice theories. The difficulty lies in the analytical analysis that should allow for apprehension of stability as well as instability of practices. I consider stability as a similar reproduction of a practice in time. It is the carrying out of a practice over and over. Even though the practice and the actions are never exactly the same, they are seen as identical. The term instability is used to refer to practices that transform over time. This is related to the development of the new and therefore social change. Within practice theories, the matter of stability and instability is seen differently by different theorists. In the following, I will highlight some of the points of view in order to depict the field of views on the matter. On the one side, he is very much quoted in Germany, by the way, we find theories that focus on the stability of the practice. One of those theorists is Andreas Reckwitz. In his theories, he leans more towards a stability of practices. He focuses mainly on the affirmation of routinization. Reckwitz argues that when the exact same practice is carried out in different circumstances, the practice might not be compatible. This leads to a confirmation that a practice, as it is normally carried out under similar circumstances, is the discord way to carry out the practice, the way it should be. There are, however, practice theories that inherently allow for instability or change. For Theodor Schatzky, practices are open, temporarily unfolding nexuses of actions. In the side of the social, Schatzky defines that change comes about with activity that alters practices and orders more robustly. He makes a distinction between two forms of changes. Firstly, as mutations that some doings themselves are, and secondly, as alterations that multiple doings bring about in individual or intertwined practices. He believes that mutation and recombination of practices are in general the forms and mechanisms of social change. When a practice consists of multiple actions that together make up the practice, the whole practice can, depending on the changed action, change by only changing one of the actions, while the other actions remain unaltered. Another theorist who threw a light on stability and instability of practices is Pierre Bourdieu. Much of what Bourdieu explores about change in practices centers on his habitus concept, which we discussed before. Depending on the conditions under which the habitus operates, the same habitus can lead to different practices. The habitus itself is in principle changeable. Next to the habitus, Bourdieu develops the concept of hysteresis. I'm not very sure about the pronunciation of this one, and I'm in too many languages to be very sure about it. But this is the word. It is the smallest definition. In its smallest definition, hysteresis means the unadjusted state of the habitus. The adjustment of the habitus is always a little bit delayed. Often, hysteresis is seen as the situation that arises when social life of the body changes in a way that it differs significantly from under which the habitus was gained, or in other words, under which the body grew up. There are, broadly speaking, three things that can happen when the state of hysteresis arises. 1. The habitus can deal with this change in structures and fields and can therefore still act appropriately despite the new circumstances. 2. Another possibility is that the new circumstances lead to change in the habitus and allows the body to cope with the new situation. But under many circumstances when hysteresis arises, 3. The habitus fails to come up with the appropriate activities. As a result, people cannot carry on the practices that have developed under those previous circumstances. This leads to a situation in which bodies have to reflect and think rational to cope with the situation. Karl Herning understands practices in a pragmatic way. For pragmatists, the consciousness starts to play a role when routines are not applicable anymore. This can be the case when the normal course of actions is disrupted. When this happens, reflection will start to happen and the differentiation of practices might occur. It is important to note that for pragmatists, this doubt is within the action or practice. As a result of this impediment, a restructuring happens based on the practical knowledge and rules the body gained in the course of its life. the solutions to the hurdles become new routines until they lead to new frictions. Consequently, practical life is a constant mix of routinizing and reflection. Even though praxeology provides us with some approaches as to how practices may change and evolve, praxeology is not providing us with in-depth ideas about how we learn and how cultures evolve. I will go into cumulative cultural evolutionary theory in order to address these questions. And I promise this part is easier. We do a little biology first. Cumulative cultural evolutionary theory stems from the field of biology and is inspired by the works of Charles Darwin. Darwin famously wrote about biological evolution of species. He determines 3 preconditions in the survival of the fittest theory: variation, competition, and inheritance. There need to be a variation between individuals in order to pass variations on. Obviously, there is not only a variety between and within species, but also between and within cultures. Darwin argued that the struggle for existence is a result of the urge of populations to increase their size exponentially, which leads to a shortage in food and living space. Consequently, there will be a competition for these resources, and naturally, not all can or will survive. These differences in survival and reproduction are in some way linked to their characteristics. Being able to successfully reproduce or transmit cultural information from one person to another is what is called inheritance by Darwin. Darwin also famously said that biological evolution is descent with modification. With this, not only information is passed down to the next generation, but also modified. Therefore, successful innovations are often slight modifications of what went before or combinations of previously separate innovations. In cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, not a physical evolution of species is studied, but a cultural transmission of knowledge. Within cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, social learning is individual learning that is, in one way or another, influenced by the social environment. The environment may play different roles for different types of learning. I will only highlight the ones relevant for my line of argumentation today, because there are many. Cultural learning. A form of learning in which the environment plays a role is cultural learning. In this form of learning, the learner is attempting to learn not from another, but through another. The learner is actively attempting to see the situation from the other person's perspective, which means that the learner not only needs to get into its own repertoire of knowledge of the activity performed by the other person, but the learner needs also to internalize something of the social interaction itself. An important part of this type of learning is learning the point of view of the other person, so we can act with meaning. Learning the point of view of the other enables us to learn about meaning itself, so that we can not only imitate the action, but practice with meaning. We know what we are doing and do this for a reason. This is also how we can understand historical context and representational implications of behavior. There are 3 types of cultural learning: imitative learning, instructed learning, and collaborative learning. Imitative learning is when the learner internalizes something of the behavioral strategies of the demonstrator. The key element of imitative learning is reproducing the intentional actions. We speak of instructed learning when some kind of teaching is involved in the learning process. In true social instructed learning, the learner learns about the instructor specifically, about their understanding of the task and how it compares with their own understanding. Through this type of learning, the learner internalizes the instructions and uses them subsequently for their own cognitive functions. Often the learner reenacts the instructions in order to regulate their own behavior when faced similar situations. In both types of learning, valued cultural elements are passed on to the next person. In collaborative learning, there's no expert that transfers knowledge. Here, the situation consists of peers working together to construct something new that neither had before the interaction began. In most cases, the individuals could not have come to the solution or discovery on their own. The result of this process is cultural creation rather than transmission. The focus is therefore on the collaborative and reciprocal element of creation. A uniquely human way of learning is cumulative learning, which is also known as cumulative cultural evolution. Human cultural traditions are often built by accumulating modifications over generations. Cumulative cultural evolution can be most easily explained by a person or group of persons who began a practice and then others take over the practice. One person in the group modifies it when he sees the need, and then others adopt the new modification. This practice gets modified again sometimes, and it is this accumulation of modifications that is called the ratchet effect. It forms the basis for cultural evolutionary theory. As a result, children are born into a world where most of the tasks that are expected of them to master are collaborative inventions. Humans transmit ontogenetically acquired information and behavior not only within their own generation, but also on to the next generation. Successful innovations are therefore often slight modifications of what existed previously, or a combination of separate innovations. Innovations are not necessarily combinations of traits, but can also arise from copying errors. There are three uniquely human forms of cooperation that play a fundamental role in human cultural transmission. Unique to humans is teaching. A teacher expends time and energy to make sure that a pupil gains information, knowledge, or skill that he wants to transfer. Research showed that human children are sensitive to teaching. They trust the adult teaching them things. They are not only open, but also ready to change their behavioral strategies. Children even see the instructions as generic instructions that come from an authoritative voice of their culture that is immediately generalizable knowledge. Humans tend to imitate for purely social reasons. They imitate others in order to be like them. For an evolutionary point of view, this conformity might be in the context of cultural group selection to show and confirm that one identifies with a certain group. This social function of imitation plays an important part of cultural transmission because it facilitates an even more faithful reproduction of behavior. Copying behavior of others for imitation's sake is just one side of this medal. On the other side is the normative dimension of human cultural transmission. Humans expect from others that they behave in a certain way. Adults expect and demand from their children that they behave in a certain way as much as children make sure that others in a group follow the conventions by enforcing normative conformity on them. So human culture persists because we tell others when they are doing things wrong. This normative dimension of human cultural transmission leads to very faithful transmission across generations and supports the further ratcheting up of the complexity of the cultural artifacts and practices. According to cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, humans have cultural brains. That is, brains that evolved above all for the acquisition of adaptive knowledge. The more adaptive and the better the knowledge there is within a group, the more it supports a larger carrying capacity and allows therefore more individuals to survive. If such groups have enough adaptive knowledge, social learning might then be preferred. Under certain circumstances, this can lead to a selective bias to determine who to learn from. Important for the building of such a collective brain are many social structures that support social norms as well as ethnic identification. Identifying which individuals belong to what group and being able to identify oneself as part of a group helps us understand which norms apply. Groups may overlap and individuals can belong to several groups. For example, one can be a student and Catholic, or Dutch and Catholic. Yeah, true. Individual choices are therefore the consequence of the social order, not the cause in which they occur. The main sources of innovation within the cultural brain are serendipity, recombination, and incremental improvement. Innovations can emerge as a result of mistakes in asocial learning or imperfect cultural transmission. Big innovations often rely on luck rather than on systematic research, like the discovery of penicillin, Teflon, vulcanized rubber, and X-rays, to just name a few. However, I want to stress that for all of these discoveries, the inventor's minds were open to what he saw, and he recognized the discovery. New ideas are also born where different elements of cultures are recombined. This means that different individuals who are exposed to the same cultural elements can come to the same discoveries independently. Famous examples of recombination and independent discoveries at the same time are evolution by natural selection by Darwin as well as by Wallace, although most of us only know Darwin, and calculus by Newton and Leibniz. In many cases, new inventions are more a case of incremental improvements, a recombination of existing elements and techniques. On individual level, individuals with multicultural experiences are more capable to connect seemingly unconnected concepts and overcome a functional fixedness when they are moving between societies. They might be able to connect dots others do not see. Innovations in human culture diffuse through transmission and selection mechanisms. Now it is the question how modifications made by individuals survive cultural selection and get passed on. In the field of diffusion of innovation, questions about how innovations are accepted or declined and what elements are at play have been studied for decades. When practices, or rather discourses, are changing, two different practices are used at the same time by different people. The change from one practice to another, the acceptance of innovations is studied in diffusion of innovation studies. Diffusion of innovation research was initially meant to study how diffusion takes place and what forces or elements are at play in this process. To get a better understanding of the processes of diffusion, I will go into the main elements that add to the diffusion of innovations. 1962, Everett Rogers published Diffusion of Innovations, in which he brought together over 500 diffusion of innovation studies. In his study, he searches for resemblances between the outcomes of the studies in order to produce a theory of the adoption of innovations. I will shortly, this time really shortly, introduce Rogers' theory based on four cornerstones: innovation, communication channels, the element of time, and social structures. An innovation is an idea, practice, or object that is perceived as new by an individual or unit of adoption. Key to this definition is that it is not about the newness of the idea, practice, or object itself, but that it is being perceived as new. According to Rogers, the perceived characteristics of an innovation by individuals determine the adoption rate. He distinguishes between several attributes of innovations, and I will only mention the most relevant for my research here. Relative advantage of an innovation, which is how much the innovation is perceived as better than the idea or technology that it supplants. Secondly, the perceived compatibility of the innovation. The innovation consists with the existing values, past experiences, and the needs of the potential adopters. When an innovation appears on the horizon, it is the question how individuals learn of it. they do so over communication channels. In its most basic form, the process contains an innovation, an individual or other unit of adoption that has knowledge about the innovation and or has used the innovation, and another individual that has not yet experienced or used the innovation, and a communication channel that connects those two individual units. The third element of the diffusion process is time. Time is of essence in the diffusion of innovation theory and is involved in several ways. Time is involved in the innovation decision process. This is the process through which an individual goes from learning about the innovation to actually adopting or rejecting it. Time is further involved in the innovativeness of an individual or other unit of adoption. The innovativeness is the degree to which an individual is relatively early to adopt the innovation within a system. For this, the different types of adopters are sorted into categories, which are called adopter categories in diffusion of innovation theory. The classification of different types of adopters are based on their acceptance in a sequence of time. We distinguish between 5 categories: the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. Lastly, time is involved in the innovation's rate of adoption within a system. This is mostly measured as the number of members in a system who adopt the innovation in a certain time period. If plotted as new adopts over time, it produces a Gaussian distribution, the bell-shaped curve. Firstly, the innovators are identified, which is the first 2.5%, followed by the early adopters, the early majority, and the late majority, and finally the laggards. At first, only a few individuals adopt the innovation. When more and more individuals start to implement the innovation, the curve starts to climb, and eventually the curve starts to level off when fewer and fewer individuals remain who have not yet adopted the innovation. The yellow line shows the same rates of adoption, but in a cumulative sum and in percentages. The structure of the social system influences the diffusion. The more structured a system is, the easier the diffusion process goes. Formal and informal structures both influence the diffusion rate as well as the communication structure. Next to the social structure of a system, its norms, the established behavioral patterns for the members of a social system, play also an important role in the diffusion rate of innovations, since they serve as a guide for what is acceptable and what is not. The norms of a system tell an individual what behavior is expected of them. An important concept, crucial for the understanding of the social nature of the diffusion process, is called critical mass. This is the point after which further diffusion becomes self-sustaining. The point of critical mass is a kind of social threshold after which the norm of the system encourages further adoption of the innovation by individual members of the system. The members of the system partly base their decision on what others are doing and what they think is expected of them to do. Although praxeological theories, cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, and diffusion of innovation theory come from different disciplines and focus on different elements of human life, they can complement each other when it comes to changing practices. I will now bring these theories in a heavily summarized version together. I will draw connections between the different theories when they are there, but not necessarily explicitly be drawn already. Next to this, I will supplement praxeological theoretical insights with elements from the other theories when praxeological theories are not yet sufficiently addressing certain questions. The notion of the agent, the subject, body, or individual is something that is shared in all 3 theories. These bodies live or grew up in a certain environment or society that influences their behavior. Practices are skillful performances executed by competent bodies, and they are as much routinized bodily activities as they are routinized mental activities because they imply a know-how of how to do something. In praxeological theories, Bourdieu's notion of the habitus is often studied to describe the dialectical influence of field and habitus. A similar notion, the cultural and collective brain notion, can be found within cumulative cultural evolutionary theory. Important for building such a cultural and collective brain are social structures that support social norms as well as group identification. Identifying oneself as a member of a group helps us understand which norms or social codes apply and what behavior is expected from us. Individuals can be part of different groups or move in different fields, as Bourdieu would say. When we are asking how an individual learns about social norms and how the habitus is embodied, then with Bourdieu the explanation stays superficial. He argues that the habitus is a result of repetition, observing, and studying by its subjects. In the field of cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, many ways of social learning are studied. Therefore, they can help us shed a light on the process of embodiment or learning about social norms. We humans are cultural learners. That means that we are not only learning from each other, but also through each other. We are learning about the point of view of the other and what others are intending to do. This allows us to act with meaning, and this is how we can understand historical context and representational implications of behavior. Learning helps us to embody cultural codes and norms and helps affirm the habitus. In the diffusion of innovation theory, all practices consist of a hardware aspect that consists of the object, materiality itself, and the software component that contains the information base or the knowledge to carry out a practice. In praxeological theories, as well as in cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, objects themselves have no meaning. We are assigning meaning to them by using them in a certain way in our practices. Although artifacts can have multiple meanings, all of them derive primarily from action. In practice theory, the routinization makes a practice out of several acts on two levels. Firstly, the routinization chain of actions forms a practice, and secondly, the routinized use of it forms a practice shared in society. The practice that is carried out by several members of society can form a discourse on how to do things and give meaning and structure. Most importantly, the practice is shared with others. The performing of the same practices is the central point of the routinization. By routinizing practices, the practices are constituted as well as reproduced. In cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, the focus is much more on normative conformity of the group, which leads in the end also to the routinizing of practices. When we identify ourselves with the members of a group and learn about their norms and social codes, we contribute to the stability of such norms and social codes, because we will act within this framework of codes, or habitus. Once we are part of a group, we learn as a child or keep learning as an adult what the social norms are and how we should behave. In order to make sure that human culture persists, we see a normative dimension in human culture. We make sure others know how to behave. This normative dimension of human cultural transmission leads to very faithful transmission across generations and supports the further ratcheting up the complexity of cultural artifacts and practices. In praxeology, as well as in cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, there is another side of the medal to routinizing or normative conformity. In praxeological theories, the occasional miscarriage of the practice adds to the routinizing strength of the practice. When looking at practice theories, we see different opinions about the stability and instability of practices. As mentioned, the habitus is in principle flexible and can alter, and therefore practices can change. Carl Herning also made a suggestion about how practices may change over time. In his pragmatical The consciousness starts to play a role when the routines of a practice are not applicable anymore, when the practice is disrupted. After reflection, the practice may be altered. This alteration or restructuring of the practice happens based on the practical knowledge and rules the body gained in the course of its life. The solutions to the hurdles, the restructured practice, becomes new routines until they lead to new frictions. Practical life is thus a constant mix of routinizing and reflection. Although he does not actively connect his theory about changes in practices to cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, his description of how practices can change over time and can grow out of the previous practice is by no means a new idea in itself. In cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, this is called the ratchet effect. Human cultural traditions are often built by accumulating modifications over generations. It is the ratchet effect that forms the basis for cumulative cultural evolutionary theory. Cultural traditions as well as modifications are passed on to the next generation faithfully. After elaborating on how practices are modified, the question is how modifications made by individuals survive cultural selection and gets passed on to others. Innovations in human culture diffuse through transmission and selection mechanisms. According to cumulative cultural evolutionary theory, there are several elements that play a role in the adoption of an innovation: content bias, frequency bias, model bias, and self-similarity. All of these elements we also find in diffusion of innovation theory. When we study the adoption of an innovation over time, there are 5 groups of adopters: the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. If we would plot the cumulative sum of the adoption of an innovation over time, we would most likely end up in an S-shaped curve. Historical praxeology reconstructs everyday patterns of past human doings and sayings. The question is, however, how can we grasp such patterns of doings and sayings from historical times? How can we make use of praxeological theories in historical studies? How can we translate praxeological theory to a more methodological approach? For this, I will, in the foundation of my methodology, rely on a first methodological outline for historical praxeological research suggested by Lucas Hazes and Konstantin Rieske in the introductory chapter of Historische Praxeologie, Dimensionen des vergangenen Handels. In this introduction, they propose a praxeological approach to study historical practices in 3 steps: materiality, routinization, and historicity. In the next part, I will adopt their structure, followed by how I will deal with innovation or the change of practices in historical research. One of the main problems in studying historical practices is that the actual practice cannot be studied. Sorry, stating the obvious. We cannot observe the bodies acting. However, what is left of the past are the objects used in practices. All the things that archives and museums hold today prove that those objects were there in a past time. These objects not only prove that they existed in past times, but they are also objects that have been used. Those handed down objects, which can be everyday things like forks and combs, but also documents, can be regarded as representatives of past practices, since bodies use these objects in their practices. It is these objects that is left of practices and that we are able to study today. For this reason, material resources are seen as the primary representatives of the practice in historical praxeological research. As primary representatives of practices, the material objects are the primary object of study. After collecting the material representatives of the practice, one tries to prove the practice. One tries to prove that it was not just one person and one action, but something that has been done by a group of people and was therefore an actual practice. Proving a practice requires 2 different approaches. First, finding multiple instances, material representatives of the practice. Engagement rings are representatives of engagement proposals. By collecting as much engagement rings as one can find, it can be proved that the practice existed. The second approach, in order to prove the practice, is looking for different kinds of materials, which might be text, that show or comment on the practice. One looks for context. The researcher tries to find other forms of information about the practice under examination. After finding many engagement rings, the practice can also be proven by multiple accounts coming from diaries, letters, books, and other kinds of sources that describe or reflect on the practice of engagement. This is the tick description of the practice. The tick description allows the researcher in the next step to zoom in and out of the practice. After collecting material and proving the routinization of the practice, we can start to uncover the meaning of the practice. In this, the researcher is in a unique position. In historical praxeology, the researcher is not studying his own time, but a past time, and can therefore use his retro perspective and overview in finding patterns. In the last step of the praxeological analysis, questions about the meaning of the praxis for the historical actors are asked. The researcher tries to uncover the contemporary logic, outcome, and meaning of the practice. For analyzing the meaning of a practice, one should show the relevance of the practice for the specific historical context. Practices show the contemporary logic and meaning, which is represented by the handed down objects and reflected in other objects we collected concerning proving the practice. In its historicity, a practice proves itself as a strong medium of past social meanings. To unlock those meanings, we can ask the following questions. Which outcomes, with what results, appear in the daily use of the practice? After describing the practice and its outcomes, we can ask ourselves, how are the historical actors linked to these outcomes and results? This can often be studied with the help of other objects, text, that tells us about the practice we are studying. We are asking what knowledge and what meaning is affecting this past practice. What knowledge is locked in the practice? The researcher also focuses on the effects of the practice, the intended as well as the unintended effects of the practice. One of the main obstacles in the use of praxeology for a long durée study is that praxeology mostly focuses on one practice at a time and in one small period of time. Praxeological studies over a course of time seem to be avoided. When studying practices longue durée, one should be able to describe the changing of practices, which one only can when describes the reference practice as well. This will be the oldest instance in which one can prove the practice. In my case, the oldest manuscript I can find of the institutes. One analyzes this practice in the manner described above. After this, one moves in time and will most likely find that at some point the practice alters. This does not mean that this is at this point already the new practice. It may just be the first time someone did it differently. After finding more and more instances of this altered practice, one can do two types of analysis that are connected to each other. Firstly, the adoption of the new practice can be studied in a diffusion of innovation way, in which the researcher studies what time is needed for the new practice to adopt. I suggest studying this as a cumulative sum, because we cannot know how much of the material is handed down to us and how much was lost in the course of time. Secondly, we can study the new practice from a praxeological point of view and ask the questions described under historicity. After this, we study the practice in relation to the previous practice. How did the practice alter? What is the implication of this alteration? What are the effects? Both analyses led us to a roadmap of how practices change over time. The first analysis tells us how quick it happened, how much time was needed to implement this new practice. The praxeological analysis tells us about the how and why of the alteration of the practice. In this very last part of my presentation, I will show you an example of praxeological analysis to illustrate this method. This example is also structured following the earlier mentioned steps of materiality, routinization, historicity, and innovation. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, my PhD research is about reading practices studied on the basis of textual articulation and navigational aids. The primary materials that reflect these reading practices are manuscripts and prints containing the institutiones. I have found about 500 manuscripts and 500 printed editions up to the year 1600. To prove the routinization of this practice, I need to find multiple instances. In my case, having many manuscripts and prints that share the same layout features will prove that the reading practice was shared among at least a group of readers. I will study different elements of the textual articulation and brought with me an example of what I'm planning to do in a quantitative part of my study. On this side, we see this digitization of the Bamberg manuscript, where we can see the beginning of the second title of the first book. In this case, it starts with a rubric, de jure naturale. Here. The rubric starts outside of the column and thus the initial belonging to the next line and actual first line of the title. As you can imagine, the way the beginning of the second title of the first book looks changed over time. To study those changes in a quantitative way and in order to prove that multiple manuscripts show the same elements in the same way, and because I have a lot of manuscripts, I'm building a database. This is an example of the structure of the database. What I'm basically doing is I ask for all those different elements I showed in the very beginning of my presentation. How does it look like? And split that in different steps my computer can read in the end, so I don't have to do everything manually. So I ask for, is it visually shown that something new begins here? If the answer is no, I'm finish early. Otherwise, I have like a ton of different questions of how and where and when. So that's what I'm working on at the moment. Then the routinization. The second part of the routinization is proving the practice with the help of other objects that can tell about the practice. For example, in my case, hue of some fixor is reflecting on what a book page looks like, which is exactly what the handed down manuscript from this period looks like, but also on the why of it. We come to this in a few minutes. In the historicity part, we ask about which outcomes with what results appear in the daily use of the practice. How are the historical actors linked to these outcomes and results? We are asking what knowledge and what meaning is affecting this past practice. What knowledge is locked in the practice? Possible answers can be the way the text is visually structured helps in identifying the text structures, but they also help in finding text passages. But Johannes Victor is giving us another answer. It is a great value for fixing a memory image that when we read books, we strive to impress on our memory the color, shape, position, and placement of letters. In what location, at the top, the middle, or bottom, we saw something positioned. In what color we observed the trace of the letter or the ornament surface of the parchment. Indeed, I consider nothing so useful for stimulating the memory as this. As a person living in the 21st century, this would not have been the first thing I would think about while looking at a manuscript page. So with the help of contemporary text, we can learn even more about reading practices. Lastly, we would study the connections and changes between the manuscripts from different times. We would, for example, find out when the first table of content was added to the institutiones, as well as the first running titles, and how long it took for these innovations to become common. We would end up with a chain of practices that are connected to each other, and for every practice we can do a praxeological analysis. Next to this, we can study the chain of practices and ask questions about the how and why of the altering practices. Through this method, we gain not only an insight in the reading practices and mise en page themselves, but also about how these reading practices and how mise en page developed. Thank you.